In the annals of human history, few figures stand out as both legendary and grotesquely tragic as Queen Isabella of Castile. Her life, marked by extraordinary faith and ruthless power, has long been sanitized by nationalist historians who praise her for unifying Spain and ushering in an era of global exploration. Yet beneath this narrative lies a chilling tale of religious obsession, psychological decay, and physical self-destruction. Born in 1451, Isabella came into a world where the Iberian Peninsula was not yet Spain, but a fractured collection of Christian kingdoms and Muslim emirates locked in a war that had lasted for centuries. The Reconquista was not just a military campaign, it was seen as a divine mission, a cosmic battle for the soul of a nation. Isabella's ascent to the throne in 1474 placed her at the helm of this millennia-long struggle. From the beginning, she saw herself as chosen by God to complete the Christian reclamation of Iberia. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was less a romantic union and more a calculated alliance, uniting Castile and Aragon into a powerful front against Islamic Granada. As their armies prepared for the final siege, Isabella made a vow so extreme, so visceral in its implications, that it would come to define her reign as much as any military conquest. In 1482, before her clergy and court, Isabella allegedly swore an oath to the Virgin Mary that she would not change her linen undergarment, the shmc, until Granada fell. What began as a pious declaration of commitment spiraled into a decade-long descent into physical and psychological ruin. By the standards of medieval hygiene, already abysmal by modern reckoning, Isabella's vow was extraordinary. Nobility typically changed their linen weekly. The poor may have gone longer, but even in those times, a decade without change was unthinkable. The shmc, which once gleamed white, grew yellowed and brown, saturated with layers of sweat, blood, and bodily fluids. Physicians at court, unable to confront the queen directly, wrote in euphemisms and metaphor. They noted festering sores, skin irritations, and what they described as corruptions of the flesh. Bacteria, parasites, and rot transformed Isabella's body into a host of decay. Yet for her, this suffering became a divine ordeal, a test of faith. She grew more withdrawn, her policies more rigid, her court more fearful. Ritual purity became an obsession, though her own body was in a state of continuous defilement. The contradiction created a cognitive dissonance that drove erratic behavior and increasingly severe religious policies. Courtiers had to endure the stench and presence of a monarch who had become a walking pestilence. They could not recoil or complain. To do so was heresy. Some developed chronic illnesses, respiratory problems, and psychological trauma from prolonged exposure to the queen's decaying presence. As the siege of Granada dragged on through the 1480s, the queen's physical decline paralleled the war's brutal attrition. Rather than swift conquest, the campaign became a slow grind of starvation, bombardment, and religious propaganda. Isabella's fixation on her vow took on mythic proportions. Islamic sources in Granada began portraying her not as a queen, but as a spectral embodiment of Christian hatred, so consumed by vengeance against Islam that she allowed her own flesh to rot in service to God. To them, she was both monster and martyr, a ghoul draped in holy intent. Her court physicians, fearful for their own lives, tried to treat her ailments without directly addressing the root cause. Some described her scratching her skin until it bled during council meetings. Her limbs bore scabs and lesions, her breath fouled by infection. Still, the queen pressed on, believing her suffering sanctified the war effort. Her spiritual advisors, rather than offer relief, reinforced her conviction. To suggest that God might release her from her vow would be blasphemy. They too were caught in a theological trap, bound to the very superstition they once encouraged. Meanwhile, the people of Spain bore the economic weight of her crusade. The 10-year siege drained the treasury, disrupted agriculture, and redirected state focus from governance to conquest. The Inquisition, established under Isabella's authority in 1478, was ramping up its brutal efficiency. Torture chambers filled, families vanished, The Queen's personal fixation on religious purity found its echo in institutional cruelty. In this environment, Isabella's vow ceased to be personal. It became symbolic. Nobles and clergy emulated her extremism with self-flagellation, fasting, and isolation. The Queen's decaying body was rebranded as a holy relic, proof of divine inspiration. But for many within her circle, it was a source of unending torment. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting, tasked with dressing her, suffered especially. Skin diseases, respiratory infections, and parasitic infestations were common among those forced into daily proximity. Yet speaking out meant exile, or worse. Diplomats visiting from France and England returned home with horror stories. Some reported that Isabella's odor permeated every court chamber, that incense and perfumes could not mask the stench. International perception of Spain was shaped not only by its holy war, but by whispers of its queen's grotesque vow. When Granada finally fell on January 2nd, 1492, it marked not just a political triumph, but the horrific culmination of a decade-long descent into bodily ruin. Physicians reportedly had to cut her undergarment away, where it had fused to her skin. Layers of rotting fabric and flesh were removed carefully to avoid fatal injury. The Queen emerged scarred, weakened, and near collapse. Chronic infections and immune damage plagued her remaining years. Yet in the months following victory, Isabella doubled down on her religious mission. The Alhambra Decree, signed just 3 months after Granada's fall, gave Jews in Spain an ultimatum: convert or leave. Centuries of coexistence were erased in one stroke. A refugee crisis ensued, scattering Jewish families across the Mediterranean. Synagogues were destroyed, lives upended. The Reconquista was over, but Isabella's war had just begun. Empowered by her victory and the perceived validation of her suffering, she intensified the Inquisition. Autos da fe, public executions by fire, became spectacles of faith. The same spiritual logic that saw her rotting undergarments as sacred now saw torture as purification. Her court became a theater of divine cruelty. Torturers were priests, executioners were monks, victims were heretics in name only, many targeted for their wealth, influence, or ancestry. Jews, Muslims, and suspected conversos were dragged into dungeons and burned in plazas while the Queen watched with approval. The gold and land seized from these victims were then repurposed for one of the most significant ventures in European history, the voyage of Christopher Columbus. While the Queen's body was still healing, her treasury, flush with confiscated wealth, financed an expedition to cross the Atlantic. That journey would change the world forever. But even this moment of global expansion was rooted in blood and obsession. Columbus himself noted the strange atmosphere of the Spanish court. His private journals referenced Isabella's intensity, her unpredictability. Though he admired her ambition, he feared her court's darkness. The Queen, who would spread Christianity to the New World, did so with blood on her hands and rot beneath her garments. Her obsession seeped into her family. Her daughter Joanna, later dubbed the Mad, grew up in a household where suffering was holiness, where love meant submission, and where disobedience meant spiritual ruin. Joanna's later psychological collapse, her delusions, erratic behavior, and eventual imprisonment may have had roots in her mother's reign. Isabella's extremism became generational trauma. In the years after the conquest of Granada, her health never fully recovered. She was prone to fever, her wounds never fully healing. Despite medical attention, the toll of a decade of bodily neglect was irreversible. Yet she refused to acknowledge weakness. She still traveled, still led, still judged. Her final years were marked by paranoia. After her death, the legend of Isabella's vow was transformed. Chroniclers cleaned it up, turning horror into hagiography. Her decade in the same SHMC became a tale of spiritual endurance rather than grotesque obsession. Nationalist historians in the 18th and 19th centuries repackaged her as the Mother of Spain, erasing the stench and suffering from the story. The Inquisition became a footnote. The suffering of Jews, Muslims, and dissidents faded beneath the myth of unity. But documents remain, physician logs, diplomatic letters, secret reports that speak of the horror. Archaeological evidence from her court shows signs of widespread illness. Royal chambers were thick with incense not for aesthetics, but to mask decay. The walls absorbed disease. The very air of Castile's court was poisoned by one woman's vow. The irony of Isabella's reign is overwhelming. She unified Spain through disunity, spread Christianity through cruelty, expanded the world's horizons by narrowing her own. Her physical decay paralleled a moral and societal decay that would haunt Spain for generations. The Inquisition outlived her by 300 years. The expulsions reshaped Europe's demographic map, and the colonial endeavors she funded triggered centuries of genocide, slavery, and cultural destruction across the Americas. Modern psychologists studying her reign have posited obsessive-compulsive disorder, religious delusion, and possibly even autoimmune complications from chronic infection. Medical professionals today believe she likely suffered from chronic sepsis, skin necrosis, and psychiatric breakdown, yet her advisors never intervened. Why? Because power shielded her, because fear silenced truth, because religion, when weaponized, can sanctify madness. Isabella's court became a microcosm of what happens when faith overrides reason, when devotion becomes derangement. Her story is not merely a grotesque legend. It is a warning. A queen who vowed not to change her undergarments until victory achieved that goal, but at the cost of her body, her mind, and countless lives. To forget the real Isabella is to risk repeating her legacy, not the legacy of conquest and colonization, but the deeper legacy of unchecked belief, enforced silence, and the rot that blooms when truth is sacrificed at the altar of faith.